What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Axioms on Trial. Long time no see. We have a nice. This is a really cool episode for me because C's put this together, and so I'm kind of going to be kind of alongside with the audience in terms of kind of figuring out kind of what it is impromptu that wants to be spoken about in regards to verificationism. I'm not really sure specifically what Cease has in mind, so I'm going to actually just pass it off to him, and maybe he can elucidate on the topic for the night, who is involved. I've purposely not really introduced myself to one of the guests so that we can have an organic kind of getting to know each other live on the air. So we're going to do that, and I thought that'd be kind of cool. And yeah, so Cease, go ahead, take it away, and tell everybody what's going on for tonight.
Sure. The conversation for tonight is going to relate to science and certain misconceptions that people have about science, the way theories develop, whether or not my methodology for epistemology is self-refuting, which I've heard some theists attempt to argue. The idea that verification is somehow circular. That, why is it that something like logical positivism ultimately failed, and what problems could that cause science, if any? And it's really just another attempt to sort of compare and contrast the theistic approach to the scientific approach and see why one is justified versus the other. And I'll be reading at some point something that was sent to me that I think is worth examining. And our guests, we've had them on before. David and Chandra, I'll bring them in now. Both physicists.
Yeah, so everybody should be familiar with David if you watch if you've watched a couple of the episodes. And I didn't actually get to do an episode with Chandra. Hopefully I'm saying that right.
Yeah, it's fine.
Yeah. So I got to watch that back over, and I thought that was definitely interesting. I wish I could have been a part of that, but I'm glad that we can all at least four be together for this one. So thank you.
You were there as a cartoon.
Yes, indeed. Yes, I was.
But yeah, so let's get right into it. David, you had mentioned that you wanted to discuss some of the misconceptions that people tend to have towards science and how theories develop. And I wanted to hear more about that, what it is that you think that we're doing when we're doing science, as opposed to what theists are doing when they're approaching it from their perspective.
Well, maybe we should start with a description or a definition of a scientific theory.
Sure.
Should we start with that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say description, and then maybe like some list of a criterion or something. I don't know if you'd be comfortable with that. I only say that because I did a call-in show, Talk Heathen, yesterday, and that was one of the first calls was about scientific theory, and it seemed like the criterion of what that would be seemed to be an important thing that I agreed with. I didn't know from your perspective if that was kind of worth investigating, or at least planting some flags.
Yeah. So, it sort of depends on who you ask, but I like sort of short, to the point descriptions or definitions. I would say something like a scientific theory is a good explanation about natural phenomena or about some aspect of nature. And of course, there are details in the word "good," and those are the kinds of things that we want to flesh out. But that's a working definition of a scientific theory.
Sure. So like you would say, I mean, would you? So like I would add like a lot of things. Like it would probably be predicated on predictions, right? And then like probably having to have some kind of novel or new feature right in the future or something like, would that be something you would be willing to
Okay, so
commit?
so part of the what makes it a good explanation.
Sure. Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
So all of that is part of what makes it a good explanation. And one of the things to recognize is that for some reason that we don't understand, nature lends itself to a mathematical description. And so a scientific theory, at least when we're talking about physics, is grounded in some kind of mathematical stuff. Right, we can look at the details of this, but if we're talking about the theory of electromagnetism, there are some mathematical equations that describe everything that the theory can tell you about electric and magnetic phenomena.
Mm.
If we're talking about the theory of curved space and time, right? The theory of general relativity,
yeah,
which Chandra described a little bit last time. We're talking about the Einstein equation, right? Everything about curved space and time is contained in this mathematical object. So yes, it explains things. There are predictions. So this is where a scientific theory, clearly starts to distinguish itself from, I don't know, a list of a series of sentences describing something. That's not the kind of thing that this is.
Mm.
It's not a series of words, right? It's once you produce this mathematical thing. Like, so for example, to be specific, Einstein constructed this Einstein equation, and didn't have any solutions. So he didn't solve the Einstein equation for even the simplest case, as we described last time we were on. Mm-hmm. Other people found solutions, and people are still finding these solutions. Part of the work that Chandra and I do is to deal with some of the solutions that Einstein had no idea about. So notice this feature that you can produce a good scientific theory and know very, very little about that theory. Right? People today know a lot more about general relativity than Einstein did at his time.
Sure.
So these are some of the features. It explains things, it predicts things. We don't even know. You don't necessarily know all the things that tells us about some domain of knowledge.
Sure. And Cease might want to chime in, but I have one thing off the top of my head that I kind of, and hopefully it's not too far off, but so like in philosophy of science, you have something called like a problem of underdetermination, right? I mean, like essentially you could boil it down to like all theories are underdetermined in some fashion. There's going to be something that kind of separates that, whether it's like the novel prediction it produces. Do you take that plus like an aspect of parsimony to be kind of relative to that, or like I guess how would you solve those like extreme skeptics in terms of underdetermination and things like that?
Well, first of all, these things seem like different things to me.
Okay.
Underdetermination, when I've heard this described to me, I always got the impression that the people who were trying to show me that there are many different theories that are compatible with the observations, I always got the impression that they had a very poor sense of what a theory is. They tended to describe theory as explanations sort of couched in words. Very far removed from this idea these are mathematical structures.
Yeah.
They would say very strange things about, well, you can just add this thing to the theory and it's a new theory. It was some very strange thing. I was never very impressed by this idea of the underdetermination.
Okay.
You could say something like that about quantum physics, right? There are different versions of quantum physics, and in principle, these are very different ideas.
You're kind of saying that like in virtue of like they're all interpretations of the same data, so to speak.
Right. They all account for the same experimental results, but
Sure.
the kind of explanation is very different between the different versions.
Okay.
So in that sense, yes, there is an example of underdetermination. But the hope is to be able to, they ultimately say different things about the world, and we should be able to, we hope to be able to distinguish. Right?
Sure.
It's very different to say, you know, there's one universe, and there's the collapse of the wave function, and there are many different universes, and there's no collapse of the wave function.
Sure.
But those are different statements about the world. Whether we can get at them experimentally is a different thing.
There's some fact of the matter, at least, that should separate the two.
There should be,
sure.
A good explanation is one that we're, at least potentially, we will be able to distinguish.
Sure.
We can't do that right now, but,
yeah. See, sorry, I didn't want to jump all over at the beginning there.
No, no worries.
A few things that I wanted to kind of lay down there. Anything specific you wanted to add?
Well, first, I want to ask Chandra if there's anything that you want to add so far to the conversation, or if there's anything about just these concepts that you're having.
Yeah, I think one nature of a good theory should be it should be able to predict something new also. Like,
yeah,
sometimes it is possible that you may imagine that there is some observation, and then you start looking for a suitable theory. But it can be other way around also. Like, you have already a theory which is telling you to go and look for something somewhere, and so you should be able to see it. For example, in case of Einstein's theory of relativity, it was mentioned about, suppose, the bending of light. Yes, so it was found, or so it was found during solar eclipse that really it happens. So it was verified later on. It was the prediction capability of a theory is one of the beautiful aspects that should be mentioned, I think.
Sure.
So I guess my next question is, how would you respond to those who think that metaphysical claims can stand on their own ground without the same sort of verification that we apply in science? And what would you say to those who think this kind of framework is self-defeating, that we can't justify that verification is the approach to give us knowledge? I mean, I'm sure you're aware, because I think we talked about this last time, of those who say that verificationism is self-defeating.
if you're not interested in verification, then I'm not sure that you're interested in good explanations.
Right.
It seems to me that it just follows from an interest in the actual world.
Well, I'm wondering if I'm sorry. I'm just wondering if maybe Cease can kind of elaborate on what that kind of objection is to the verification.
So
problem you.
Yeah, so I want to keep going for a minute. I'm
sure.
going to try to find
Yeah, just at some point, maybe I just want to plant a flag there so that at least, like, me and other people in the audience can kind of see what the objection is tandem to. But sorry, David.
No, I think verification is crucial. Of course, there are subtleties there. But how do you verify? How do you support the theory? Right. We always say that the goal isn't to prove a theory right. You can't do that as a issue of principle, because there's always potentially some experiment that shows you that something in your theory is wrong. To give a practical example, right, Newton's theory of gravity explained all manner of observations.
Sure.
We use it to predict lunar eclipses, and so there's something that you can say there's some truth behind this. But then, of course, you get to certain objects, even in the solar system, for example, Mercury, and you struggle to explain its orbit. There's a strange feature of its orbit that you can't explain with the mathematical structure there.
Sure.
And so the theory has failed at some point. And so that's where Einstein comes in and says the reason why it fails is because this theory isn't, it's an approximation to a deeper theory, and that deeper theory has very different principles.
Sure.
But then you can see the Newtonian structure in the mathematics emerge, where the ideas of relativity don't matter so much. So here's another place. Sorry.
Oh no, go ahead, finish.
No, we're just going to say there's another place of misconceptions, which is that, and this is due to, I don't know, maybe arguably a philosopher, Thomas Kuhn, who said that scientific theories, they get disproven and completely replaced by new scientific theories. I would argue that's completely wrong.
Sure.
So it's not that Newton's theory of gravity was shown to be completely wrong and set aside. It was sort of expanded upon. That's a better way. In fact, we use Newtonian gravity to do most of the things that we need to do around the Earth,
sure.
launch satellites and so on.
Yeah. So I'm wondering if you'd be comfortable with like the idea that it's provisional, and really in any theory there's going to be some ignorance that's going to creep into, once you kind of break it down fundamentally, like some ignorance will creep in, which is why it's going to be provisional, because the second you kind of fill in those gaps, right, you're just going to be expanding upon the theory, essentially. That'd be a fair.
Can I quickly add something? Like,
of course,
we cannot call it wrong or some weakness. Rather, we should call it a regime of validity. Yeah. So
sure.
There is certain regime where Newtonian theory is working perfectly, and there is other regimes where it is not applicable. So every theory has a regime of validity.
Yeah.
So once you go beyond that, you need some better theory for including more factors. Like in relativity, you need to think about gravity, means extreme gravity or extreme speed. So in that case, maybe Newtonian is not applicable.
Okay.
But however, you cannot say this is wrong.
So that actually raises something for me to ask both of you. And this is kind of a side thing, and I don't want to take this on the wrong path, and I'll have Cease put it back on track. But I wanted to ask you both because that brings up to me, especially when you talk like applicability. Let's use applicability of mathematics, right? So like William Lane Craig kind of puts forth some argument that I can't remember who he cites or what paper he cites, but essentially he cites like the applicability of mathematics. And it somehow surmounting to like God, right? Like God exists, essentially, is the conclusion, right? There's the fact that we have this like ability to even have applicability. And now I want to like have a caveat that I think he agrees like models aren't perfect, right? And he's going to agree it's just the fact that we can even do that with models. Have you ever heard that argument from like theists or anything like that? Or is that something that's been presented where you look at the fact that it's applicable? I don't know if that's something you've heard or if that's just completely foreign to you.
I don't see this getting at anything, but I would say that given what Chandra said, it's not the term provisional is not the right term to use. These theories are not provisional; they're just limited within certain domains of applicability. They have a regime of applicability. So, right, if you want to go deeper and understand gravity, you're going to use the theory of general relativity.
I see.
But if you want to remain, and if you want to understand how an object falls here in my room, I don't need to use machinery of general relativity. I use Newtonian gravity, which is applicable in that domain where things aren't moving very fast, right? I let the thing go, it's going to move, maybe it's going to fall a meter, and it's not going to move that fast. It's not going to be close to the speed of light. So Newtonian theory is perfectly valid. So I wouldn't say the theories are provisional. They are getting, so whatever the deeper theory is behind, say, curved space-time. Curved space-time is some approximation to something deeper. I've heard things like, the theory is really about the cooling of space and time, the cooling and heating of space and time. Very abstract idea.
Yeah.
And then it gives way to this idea of the curvature of space-time. And then if you look at the phenomenon in my room, then you can say, you know, it's a force of gravity that behaves like the inverse square law, things like that, and that's good enough. So all of these, whatever that deeper theory is, it's not that these other theories are provisional. They're just applicable in a different domain.
I see.
So I want to bring up something which I think is kind of at the core of this conversation from my perspective. And it's, you know, basically my endless argument against theism is that, from my perspective, they lack the methodology to separate the imaginary from the actual. And so when I bring this up, I think his internet died. Okay, well, he'll be back in a minute. But you know, so when I say that for something to be epistemically justified, you need to be able to show how a claim or a belief about the world isn't just imaginary. I'm accused of being something like a logical positivist or verificationist. And I want to read to you what the definition of verificationism is and why it's been argued in philosophy that it is self-defeating. And I want to see how you respond to that concept, if that's fine with you.
Sure.
So verificationism, also known as the verification principle, is a philosophical doctrine which maintains that only statements that are empirically verifiable or verifiable through the senses are cognitively meaningful, or else they are truths of logic. And then the principal criticism of this perspective is that it is itself not an empirical proposition. It is itself on its own terms either meaningless or else tautologically true as an arbitrary definition of meaningfulness. Are you following what that is saying?
Yeah.
So people have used this notion as somehow a criticism of my perspective that the scientific method is the only approach that can come close to closing the gap between the imaginary and the actual. And so it is their way of sort of saying religion and the way in which people derive their theism through their metaphysics is as valid as what we're doing in science, because somehow science itself is also based on certain presuppositions.
Look, you're starting to bring in all sorts of things here that what you described reminds me of logical positivism, right? Now, I remember this sort of vaguely from being a student, but it's the idea that science should only talk about the things that it can observe. Is that correct?
If I'm not mistaken, let me just double check.
So verificationism, or like, I mean, essentially the verification principle is going to be like a huge principle, or I guess thesis of logical positivism in the first place. My understanding was having to do with analytic and synthetic distinctions, and the reason why I think I believe what Quine did was show that the verification principle, the statement about whether it needs to be analytic, or I'm sorry, it needs to be synthetic in order for it to like function. The statement itself was like it was neither analytic or synthetic, or I can't remember. I'm losing off the top of my head. I have to go back and look, but essentially it was like a self-defeating principle is how Quine, I guess, took it. I'd have to go back and look because it's been way too long for me.
So I have the specific definition here.
Okay.
I didn't want to get it wrong. So it was developed by the members of the Vienna Circle, and they considered that the only meaningful philosophical problems are those which can be solved by logical analysis. And so this was accused as being inconsistent.
But isn't, I remember observation, what you can observe directly was a key aspect of this.
So yeah, I'm looking for where it talks about the.
Okay, but I mean, we can talk about how you're supposed to verify a scientific theory, right?
Mhm.
This is what you want to discuss. You don't need to verify every possible aspect of a scientific theory. That's impossible, first of all.
Mhm.
So again, I think this goes to the confusion as to what a scientific theory is. Right? Scientific theory is a good explanation about some aspect of nature. Let's say we're talking about gravity, right? How does this object fall here? Let's look at gravity, at some aspect of gravity. Do we have to look at how the object falls on the surface of Mars to be very confident that this theory is right? Right, so the theory tells us that forces produce accelerations and that mass kind of resists acceleration, and we can do experiments and we can verify that to great accuracy here on the Earth, but nobody is going to go to Mars to verify those equations. So we can't verify every possible application of the theory. But why would you think that that's necessary?
Right. Yeah, I think there's a confusion where, at least from my experience of having these conversations with theists, they somehow misunderstand what you're describing as somehow giving credence to the fact that when they're applying their metaphysical jargon, that, well, it's okay for them to not be able to verify every aspect of what they mean by God, because they have a good explanation as far as the kind of things we're observing in the world as needing to be explained by the God hypothesis. Like they think they're doing something similar to what you're describing. Obviously, I don't think they are, but that's the kind of the perspective, right? That they think what you just described somehow gives credence to theism as opposed to separate it from the scientific project.
So are there people who will claim that there's a mathematical structure behind some theistic idea?
I think there are some. I think there are some that try to use math as somehow evidence for God. I think those attempts.
So give me some equation. Give me some mathematical equation from some theist from which I can then solve this equation, right?
Right,
So
right.
these mathematical things called equations, they're differential equations. There are certain quantities in them, and the equations are telling you the rate at which these quantities change, whether with respect to space or with respect to time, right? It's a very precise statement. And so if I want to know something about this quantity, then I'm going to extract this thing from these equations. I have to integrate these equations. That's what it means. The opposite of what the mathematical equation is doing, which is telling me about how these things are changing. So I have to I kind of have to extract these things from the equations. And then I can if I know something about their values in some place and at some moment in time, I can tell you what this quantity is doing in space and time, everywhere, and in the past and in the future.
Right.
So
yeah, I mean, obviously,
it's the same kind of thing. If you have a mathematical equation that does that kind of thing, otherwise it's a completely different kind of object.
Yeah,
a completely different kind of idea. It doesn't make any sense to compare these things.
Yeah, I think it's misusing the terminology and the methodology to, hide something else. Like, I think my problem is that a lot of people want to hide behind the word metaphysics, as though metaphysics doesn't need to be justified in the same way. Chandra, did you want to add anything? I saw you were laughing there. I mean, I agree with you. Obviously, any person that thinks math can prove delusional.
I think in some sense we are mixing two regimes. I think the science has to deal with natural world and what we can call as a physical world and related predictions and those things. But when it's think about God or religion, I think it has to do with something spiritual in some sense, not about the physical world we are talking about.
Right.
So I think we are interfering with each other, the science and religion. So we have to keep it separate in some sense based on their own regimes. So
yeah, I think that's a fair point. I think that I think theists want to have their cake and eat it too, right? Like on one hand, they want to say that we can't verify we're applying the wrong tool when we want to use a scientific method to understand God, but then they want to claim that they know God exists. I mean, that's my problem fundamentally is how do you talk about knowledge and how do you justify your epistemology once you've removed the scientific method from the approach? Like that's the core question is there, outside of the scientific method, are there other ways to arrive at any knowledge claim? And I think that's where my disagreement lies with them, because I don't think that there is. I think the scientific method is the best we have and all we have, and its potential shortcomings don't justify any of the alternatives, where instead most of them want to say that the scientific method is useful in one area, but then we can arrive at a knowledge and a truth applying these other ideas, which for me, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, I was going to say that for me, they don't have any kind of ground to justify their belief systems.
Well, see, so it seems like what you're saying to me, at least all I hear when I hear like this whole like, I don't have to use the tool at which you use that's successful, is this tool has been inconvenient for my thesis, and so therefore I'm going to kind of just add this idea that I don't need it in my worldview, right? And that's all I ever hear when someone goes, yeah, my thing's separate from, and so I might have pushback on Chandra's point, because I don't know what spiritual means. It could be the case that something I'm in the realm of that if somebody wants to say like that the spiritual is something or that they're separate, I'm in the boat to say it seems that we only can make that assessment because it's inconvenient for your position. It seems to be that the fact that science doesn't actually help that case, that now we have to kind of separate the two. But I might be on a different boat than other people on that.
Well, but and someone like Otangelo, right, who claims that he's looking at the evidence and arriving at the best worldview that accounts for the evidence, isn't acknowledging that he's not actually doing that. He has certain metaphysical assumptions, like complexity needing design,
that
are not supported by the phenomena we actually observe in the world, but that he's manipulating the evidence to fit his own agenda. He hasn't actually supported his metaphysical assumptions there.
My understanding is that there are plenty of theists who aren't playing this game of looking at theistic ideas in terms of science as scientific ideas. They're not doing this parallel.
Right, but those who are not doing the parallel are claiming that there are ulterior ways, of knowing, which is fundamentally what I'm saying is problematic. Because, again, on what grounds outside of the scientific method do we arrive at a methodology that can separate the purely imaginary or conceptual from the actual? That's my issue. And it doesn't mean that, like you said, I don't think that translates into having to verify everything.
let's say that let's talk about the fine tuning briefly, which we mentioned last time. If it's true, right? We've discussed this at some level, and we pointed out that it's not really clear that there is actually a fine tuning issue, right?
Yeah.
But there might be. What if the science ends up honing in on a real fine tuning issue, and the explanation doesn't emerge? Can't you say something like, there's something here that's pointing in this direction, right? Didn't have to be that way, right? So in that sense, right, the people who appeal to fine tuning have a point. Right. And that's the reason why we explore whether there's actually a fine-tuning issue or not. If there is, then we should concede that there's something there that's pointing in a certain direction. Of course, we want to do good science and see if science can illuminate the issue or not. But
I mean, I have said that the fine-tuning argument is the best argument that theists have, but to me, even something, being unlikely the case if the constants were different, I don't see how from there it follows that intention is behind it.
I'm a little. Sorry, I want to back up because I'm a little opposite of both of you. I think that when you concede a fine tuning, that seems to be indicative of a naturalist or a physicalist world. The fact that there are physical constants that are required for life to form, whereas with God, there's no need to care about what an atom is doing or what a molecule is. Like God isn't limited by constants of neutrino or like the mass of a neutrino. What couldn't God just make the ratios of like tau or like I think it was like tau neutrinos or things like that? Like, couldn't he just make them whatever he wants? Right? Why wouldn't he be able to?
You're going deeper. You can just say, look, we can concede there could be no fine-tuning issue. That might be the case. In fact, I think it probably will end up discovering that there's no.
Well, I guess I'm saying that an atheist. I guess I'm saying it's not exclusive in the sense of like an atheist could say there's a fine-tuning problem and not concede that points any direction, and a theist could say there is no fine-tuning at all, and that that doesn't point to like some naturalist thing, right? I don't think that I guess I'm in a position, maybe it's a minority. I don't think that the idea of fine-tuning points one way or the other. I think either position could make an argument using that, I guess.
I think I'm with you.
Yeah. But that's just my little tangent on that. But yeah, I don't want to get off topic on that. But
so I wanted to read you this quote, and I read it to the guys prior to the show, just kind of sticking on the same subject here. And you can tell me what you think as well. Hold on a second. Getting back to it. Where did it go? Okay. So, and I won't say who this is from because I haven't gotten the okay from them.
Speaking of
that, I'll read it anyway. They said the following. Testability needs to be worked out first. Can we test a metaphysical claim merely by thinking about its entailments and whatnot? We surely do this all the time in philosophy. Falsification is not even a requirement for good science. Even Carroll argues this.
For a second? Because I don't understand where in philosophy do you have testability? Surely we do this in philosophy?
No, he's saying that that you are testing a metaphysical claim just by thinking about its entailments. I think what he means is whether or not an argument is coherent or whether it entails certain logical contradictions. I think maybe that's what he might mean. I'm unclear. I mean, I need to ask for further elaboration, but I think...
So, is there an implication here that, I mean, you're using this as a criticism. Someone here is criticizing scientific theories. And
I think what it... Well, no, I don't know if it's
incoherent.
I don't think he's criticizing scientific theories. I think he's saying that there are ulterior approaches to derive knowledge from, and that they don't need to be what we do in science to still be valid sources of knowledge. Now, I don't know how we can say that. He says falsification is not even a requirement for good science. Even Carroll argues this. I don't know what he means by that. Like, how is falsification not a good requirement for good science? I mean, that's the first I've heard of that.
So most people will probably disagree with that.
Yeah, and
falsification is a cornerstone of what you're trying to do.
So are you aware of Carroll saying anything along these lines?
Yeah, he said something about the idea that the scientific theory can be so good that you could argue that it must, in some sense, be true, but you can't verify some important aspects of it because, for example, string theory says things about the world at a scale that we just can't access. It doesn't mean you're not going to test any aspect of it, but that's the idea that we could end up with a principle that an encompassing principle, mathematical structure that says something about the world at a scale that we just don't have access to.
So, if I'm understanding correctly, that doesn't suggest that you throw out falsification altogether.
No, I think he's ultimately, we'd have to see where he wrote this or where he said this. He's saying you don't need to falsify the theory in every domain of applicability, but we already know that.
Right.
That's impossible to do. Maybe it's a question of, is this an important domain of applicability or not? Some question. I don't think he just wants to trash falsification, but
right.
I don't know.
So I'll keep reading here. He says, atheists tend to think that theism predicts less suffering than there is. Without this predictive power, the POE, which, Mike, I don't know if you know what that means. I don't know what the POE stands for, would not ever be successful. And then he says, for me, let's think the first way. Say we begin by analyzing the concepts of actuality and potentiality. And then from nature, we generalize and come to certain foundational principles about their intrinsic relationship. So I already have a problem here.
You say whose quote was that from?
Well, I'm not going to give his name. He's someone
that's
talking
right.
to on Discord.
Okay.
But it's almost like he's working backwards. Like he has his concepts that he calls actuality and potentiality. These metaphysical concepts, where have they been derived from? And then he's looking backwards to try to somehow fit reality into these concepts, which I don't know on what grounds he shows aren't purely imaginary. Like, what does it mean? What is pure actuality? What is potentiality? I've seen arguments for that stuff, but it doesn't. I don't find it to be in any way convincing.
Well, I'd have to listen back to what you said about him, by the way. But I just wanted to say the whole pure actuality. When you get into that argument, or if you're going to say like this gets into a different topic, but you talk about like God being pure actuality. From my perspective, it entails necessitarianism. When you start talking about like pure actuality, it seems that you can cash that out in a very similar way that you can with a strong PSR, right? Like a very strong PSR that it's just going to commit you to some form of necessitarianism, which is ultimately like self-refuting. But I want to kind of get with you on that discussion behind the scenes because I'm interested on that for sure. But anyway, sorry, I don't want to jump in there and derail.
Well, I think this also goes back to what Chandra and David were saying earlier, right? Like, these seem to be just words. Like, how do we connect those words to something real in the world? I at that point, like you can't just have metaphysics and think that that's enough. You know, like, what do you guys add to that, if anything?
Chandra, do you want to say something?
Yeah, no, means for me it is beyond my capacity to comprehend. Like it is quite. So I just feel like it is just a jargon of words, as I mentioned before, and
Right.
so
Right, okay.
I don't know what any specific thing you can take out of it. Okay,
Yeah.
that is
No,
so.
When I define the explanation as, a good explanation that deals with some aspect of the natural world that's couched in mathematical form. That's when you look at the mathematical equation, that's a very precise kind of statement. There are things in the mathematical equation and the equation is telling you how these things are changing with respect to other parameters, and you can figure out, you can solve this quantity. Whether it's the value of the acceleration of gravity, the degree of the curvature of space and time, the strength of the electric field, the induced current in a circuit. These are all very precise kind of mathematical concepts, physical quantities that have mathematical description. And so there's a precise sense in which you're using words and, I don't know what the person means when they're talking about actualities, potentialities. How do we anchor these things into the real world?
Well, from that standpoint, like they're gonna be under some like Aristotelian or like Thomist notion of like motion, right? So they're gonna say, essentially like Phaser kind of cashes this out, and like that a candle essentially has the potential to be a pool of wax, right? But that potential cannot be actualized unless something actualizes that potential. Do you follow me? So you got a candle, you have a candlestick that has a potential to be a pool of wax, right? Something has to actualize the potential of being a pool of wax. And so a lot of arguments like from Thomism and things like that.
What is the thing that actualizes? What are we talking about here?
Well, essentially this wants to get you all the way back to God as like the unmoved mover, the unactualized actualizer. But the problem is this goes back to what I said earlier, that if God's just purely actual, there's a bigger philosophical issue that is even more difficult to get into, which is that it commits you to necessitarianism and the idea that God basically it commits you to this idea that the world could only be one way, and therefore God had no free choice in choosing, which is against a lot of like Christian doctrines and things like that. So they don't want to admit that God had no free choice in choosing, right?
I don't see how any of this gets you to talk about God in any way, because these actualities and these potentialities, these are, we're talking about a very straightforward physical system. A candle is in a certain state, it's matter in a certain state, it becomes wax if the conditions of temperature are met, and then you can describe physically in terms of equations, solving the equations, why you end up in the state we call wax. The candle melts. I'm not sure why this is a space.
Well, so you're the guy that I think it's your colleague, or I believe the guy that you worked with that came on here. He kind of couches causation in this way himself. He takes like per accidens and per se, which is I always get confused on the per se and per accidens, but I think per se, one of them is like father of father of father, and the other one's like moving my hand with a stick that pushes the ball. So I move my hand, moves the stick, moves the ball, right? This like chain of causation. I get you. I don't know how it goes back, because the way I look at it is the actual thing is me pushing the stick, which pushes the ball. But at the end of the chain, you just get to me. I don't know where I'm being sustained by God or something, right? Like me moving my arms. Am I sustained by the actualized? I get you. It's a weird thing, but
also,
I wish we had
both of you guys, as you guys have stated in previous episodes, all that assumes causality as being a fundamental aspect of reality.
It's a metaphysical thesis, essentially. Yeah.
Which seems to me it's in conflict with what you've described to be modern physics.
Well, you're describing straightforward physical processes that we experience every day, and this, you don't need to go that deep. You don't need to go to, cause and effect.
Tell that to Thomists. I've been trying to tell that to Thomists for a while now.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I don't see any need to go beyond the basic physics that was available, hundreds of years ago. We're in the space of simple mechanics. You can talk about forces giving rise to accelerations, and that's all you need. I'm not sure why we seem to think there's something else here that needs to come into play.
And I think CJ puts up a good point, right? So this is a good example. Say they want to say something like an apple has the potential to decay or fall, but it can't instantiate the state of affairs unless something outside the apple actualizes that state. And essentially, they're looking for the match that sets off the forest fire, right? That's what they're doing.
This is just ignoring physics. These things are not, there aren't question marks here. The apple doesn't fall, because there's a theoretical description here, that comes from the theory. It tells us why the apple falls or why it doesn't fall. In Newtonian physics, there's a normal force that's holding the apple on the table, and that's why the apple doesn't fall.
Sure.
It's balancing the gravitational force.
So what do you think about this idea of, so a lot of people who have responded to these arguments have cited a concept called existential inertia. Are you familiar with that at all?
No, because it's not needed.
Well, so the idea is like it's like an objection to the Thomist idea of sustaining causes, right? So like essentially the idea between the Thomists is like God is sustaining these causes, and God's doing like a lot of work, right? He's sustaining all these causes, he's concurring with all the causes that are being sustained. And so the objection is that maybe someone like yourself or me, I kind of hold the position that it's easier or it's more parsimonious to add an idea of existential inertia, right? The idea is that things just persist, everything that exists just persists in existence unless knocked out of existence, right? Or taken out of existence or changed form, I guess would be a better way in terms of maybe like first law of conservation or something like that, right? So you would just say, rather than having some ontology or metaphysical baggage of a God sustaining all these causes, you could just kind of cash it out as things just inherently have this ability to persist in existence. I mean, would you, from your background in physics, would you think that's a good objection to the kind of thesis of sustaining causes that they want to lead back to? They
just ignoring our current understanding of the natural world. In the absence of an external force, an object maintains its momentum.
Mm-hmm.
That captures what you need to know.
Yeah. So I think
I see no reason to assume that there has to be some, grounding of all other causes. Like there has to be some, I know that Thomists, I think, if I'm not mistaken, take issue with the idea of an infinite regress of some kind, which I'm not necessarily even arguing for that, but they want to say that there is some kind of underlying force that gives rise to all other causes and changes in states. But I see no reason to see that explanation as credible.
Have given us a bunch of examples that physical theory can handle perfectly well.
Right.
Yeah.
And you seem to have suggested that we need to go elsewhere to look for explanations. This is what I don't understand.
Right.
Yeah. No, I would agree. I mean, so would that be would that be a point of parsimony, right? For you just to say like, I don't, why add all these assumptions or ontological commitments? Why not just shave them off in virtue of a theory that explains all the data without all of that, right? I mean, like, would you agree like simplicity of the theoretical virtue is important, as as well as explaining the data, obviously.
Sorry, I think Chandra, you want to say something?
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
Yeah, no, I was wondering that those people who wants to get deeper in the state issue, yes, how this matter is there and how it is, why it is there. So I think I wonder those kind of people really understand what physical theory is trying to address. Like,
Right.
means you can go beyond and more deeper is questions. I mean, after understanding what the physical theory is trying to address. I think people are not giving enough time to understand what really physical theory is trying to address here.
Yeah.
So it is the lack of homework on their side that they always question that what physical theory is saying or what it cannot say. Before you want to explore that what physical theory cannot say about, you should try to understand first what physical theory is really saying about.
Sure.
Right.
Well, I should add, Chandra, that like this idea stems also from like Aristotelian physics, where they're not going to mention to you that that at one time these physics are saying that these like crystalline spheres are holding up stars and planets in the sky, right? Like a completely abandoned idea that like obviously none of us are taking seriously. Like they're not going to mention that all their kind of ideas are stemming from something that also had this attached to it, right? That we're all gonna agree is absurd, and that's something that bothers me in these conversations, as well as when I talk about when we get into metaphysics. I'm never actually getting the full picture up front. Like I'm not knowing about the demons and the angels or the jinns or whatever it might be in their religion. It's always just like this very I don't know if austere is the right word. It's very like just different. I feel like disingenuous version of theism that I have to go up against, as opposed to what they actually believe with everything packaged, and involved. But
I wanted to connect to what Chandra said, because I think this is an important point. What we're dealing with here is just a misunderstanding of what a scientific theory is. Mm-hmm. And I think this is something that shows up, Mike, when you say something like, isn't the principle of parsimony useful here? Mm-hmm. Right? You looked at something and you said, somehow the principle of parsimony allows us to choose the scientific explanation over this other explanation that I don't really understand. But that's not correct, because this is not an issue of, the simplest explanation. This is an issue of you just ignoring the explanation. The physical principles, they deal with the object. What was it? The apple, in its state before it fell, after it falls, whatever it interacts with. It's not like suddenly things stop and we need to come in with something else, right?
Yeah.
Mechanics deals with the forces that apply to objects. So the apple continues to be described by the equations of mechanics. You just have to solve those equations. So to me, it sounds like it's a misunderstanding of what a physical theory is when you say something like maybe the idea of parsimony comes into play here.
Sure.
You have to solve the equations and see what you get. And if there are other forces coming into play, now your equations are changing. I dropped the apple. I know it's a gravitational acceleration G that describes the object. I can develop the equation, tell you exactly where it will be. Once it hits the floor, there's another constraint. There are other forces coming into play. I have to then get the equations at a different time.
So you're almost saying like even introducing this idea of parsimony between, like, say, the two, whatever you would even call theirs a theory, like it's almost giving them too much credit because
Absolutely.
they're not.
You're just ignoring the fact that the theory continues to apply. Sure. You got the impression that somehow the theory applies
to any set of kind of hypotheses with the data, essentially, right? And that's just not the case, right? I mean, it's because it's not doing the same work, at least in virtue of what the actual theory is set out to do.
The theory is a complete beast. It's not an incomplete thing where you can describe the apple while it's falling, but once it hits the floor, now everyone's confused.
Sure. Yeah. It makes sense. Yeah.
And also, I would like to add that the knowledge or the physical theory is an ongoing process. We are still discovering more and more phenomena and more explanations. So we will never be like arrogant enough to say that, okay, now our theory is complete, ask us whatever you want to ask. Means we want to improve it, and we want to explore it more. So
Sure.
it is ongoing process. It is not like complete what other people will say, okay, God is there, so everything is there and we can explain everything. We don't claim in that way.
Yeah.
So we are just the ongoing process.
Yeah, that's a good point. So I mean, would you guys agree that sort of my pointing to the theist inability to move their beliefs from imaginary to credible in the actual world is not a kind of blind logical positivist position, right? Like, I'm not saying in asking them to be able to move from the potential to the actual, from the possible to the real. I'm not suggesting that every little thing that we believe has to be verified, entirely. Like, I'm okay with, the idea that we can believe something just based on, like, what's the word I'm looking for? I'm blanking on the actual word, but possibility. Like, what we have good enough reasons, good enough evidence to believe in something, even if we don't have certainty. It's more likely that an explanation is going to be accurate than one that doesn't have any basis whatsoever.
You're saying like with like fallibilistic considerations, maybe, or something.
Yeah, like I'm not claiming that we need to be able to verify every little thing to the sort of the most, because it's impossible to do that.
You're not doing that in science.
Right.
We've already discussed this. You're not doing that in science. You couldn't possibly do that.
Sure.
In science. There's an infinite number of things that are implied by a theory. You're not going to explore them, right? You explore some subset.
Right. I think they're making a false move by trying to pretend like theism is doing the same thing there. Like, that's what I'm trying to point to, is that our lack of complete verification in science doesn't give credence to their metaphysical jargon when they're trying to define God into existence.
Look, I would say that theism is not, in theism, theistic ideas are not scientific ideas. They're very different. So when you're operating in the space of ideas that are not scientific, you can still subject them to a rigorous analysis. Or the notion of a good idea, right? You can still come up with better ideas despite the complete absence of observational evidence, let's say. Right? That's still a possibility. So there's no reason why you can't talk about coherent, a logical idea, a reasonable idea, a good idea even, despite the absence of observational evidence.
And what would you say? What would you say, despite the absence of observational evidence, what would make those things good ideas as opposed to bad ones?
I don't know, but the principle of parsimony, right? So let's say that I want to imagine. I can't ask you this question, but I want to imagine how it is that Mike got home today. Right. So he was somewhere, and he was at work, and he got in his car and he drove, and then came into his house, or did he travel on the International Space Station, and he left early this morning and did whatever it is that the astronauts do to come back to Earth, and and then he got in his car and came home. That's not violating physical laws in either of these cases, but the principle of parsimony. Comes into play. What's the simplest explanation, right? The more logical explanation, the simplest explanation. It's the former, right?
Sure.
So you can distinguish between, better ideas and worse ideas.
I think the analogy you gave, I think, even gives too many tools to the theistic approach, because at least with the examples you gave, we have a wealth of background where what you've described is actually possible. Like, we know that it's possible for astronauts to go into space because we've seen it. With theistic ideas, my issue is that you can't even get off the ground. You can't even show that the examples you're creating.
Okay, I said, I said that imagine a situation where I can never ask.
Sure. No, I get it.
Yeah.
That's sort of the analogy. But I'm obviously using something that lends itself to the scientific enterprise.
I kind of, I hammer home Cease's point that it's like, if what you're postulating is no different than something I can imagine off the top of my head, then I think that's just inherently a problem. Like that's not good that whatever alternative idea I can think of is indistinguishable from the imaginary God hypothesis that you might have.
You guys would agree, right? I imagine you guys would agree that there are better and worse religious ideas. You wouldn't put them all in the same basket, right?
I'm sorry, it broke up for me.
I said you guys would agree that there are better and worse religious ideas, right?
I mean, I would say they're all equally unsubstantiated. But from my intuitions, maybe, but I don't think that my intuitions hold much like epistemic warrant in the matter.
I would say that there are worse and better ideas, although I think most of them are on pretty equal footing or lack thereof.
Well,
I'm kind of looking at it as either it's been reasonably substantiated or it hasn't. But I guess, maybe there's some gradients there.
Here's a religious idea. There's an intelligence at the heart of the universe. Done. And compare that to a religious idea that has all sorts of doctrines about, virgin births and various processes that violate physics.
Okay, sure. Yeah. Yeah, well, essentially, okay, I would agree because maybe one has less like ontological commitments, and I could just say, I mean, you just are. And there's an argument to be said about ontological commitments by numbers and whether that matters. I'm one to think it does, but I would agree. Yeah.
So, just a quick question. Mark asks, I'm wondering what David thinks the ontology of physical law is.
I would assume you would say it's descriptive, but
sure, physical laws, right, are these mathematical things that are part of a physical theory.
Okay.
Right. So we want to be specific. F equals ma. Is a physical law. It's at the foundation of what's called mechanics.
And also we can add the set of Maxwell equations that can describe all the electromagnetic processes you can observe now.
Right.
So there are a set of 4 equations, and they are describing all the processes related to electricity and magnetism. So,
Mike, did you want to play the short clip?
Yeah, I can throw that on. I got that on.
It's only, I think, like a minute or so.
Yeah, let's do it. I want to make sure I got it unmuted.
Is there anything else that you guys want to add to this?
I think I would like to say one quote from one professor from MIT. So Alan Lightman, he said, as a scientist, I don't believe science will ever discover whether God exists, nor do I believe religion will ever prove it.
Sure. Yeah, that's a good quote. I like that.
I think there's one thing that we can do if we do anything that's useful is to try to get people away from the idea that a scientific theory is similar to a collection of sentences or statements about the way the physical world is. That's completely off.
Okay.
All right, I'm going to pull this up. So video is called Science Doesn't Say Anything, Scientists Do. I have not seen this. I believe Cease has, maybe. And so, yeah, impromptu.
Oh, all scientists forced to retire after realizing the science is now settled.
Frank Turek, isn't that?
Yeah.
Yep. Oh, I stopped right there. Okay.
Oh. What happened?
That's what you get for positing it, I guess.
Isn't that the very definition of settled science, not science?
Right.
Because the whole point of science is like new data can arrive at
That's right.
change the conclusion.
Now, this is brilliant as well. I have a saying that is from our book, Stealing from God, that science doesn't say anything, scientists do. Science doesn't say a word. In fact, I was on a plane yesterday with a lady. I was talking to her about vaccines, and she said, just follow the science. I said, science doesn't say anything. Scientists do. And she said, well, follow these scientists. Well, why those scientists? How do you know they're right? What sort of assumptions are they bringing to the table? What kind of data did they have? Is it good data? Are they interpreting it rightly? This is why we get so many conflicting recommendations on COVID, because scientists say stuff. Science doesn't say anything. And where are they coming from? What data do they have? How are they interpreting the data? So another brilliant headline.
Apologists are always saying that they were on a plane yesterday talking to an atheist. Is that always true? Or
Okay, that's so weird, because I was about to pause it and say, why does it always seem like apologists are always talking to like some random? Like, I was thinking in my head was like, it seems like that they just sit there and think, all right, what situation can I create where I talk to this atheist or science lover? But anyway, I'm glad he said what that guy said.
I mean, Turek is a perfect example of just somebody who just is so arrogant and so clueless. Like his level of understanding of science and philosophy is embarrassing, and yet he just talks like he's a fucking expert. It turns my stomach. So I just wanted to see how you would respond to that kind of statement.
So the claim is science doesn't say anything, scientists do. What do you guys think?
But I think, do they know the definition of science and scientists? That is my first question. Like what they mean by science and what they mean by scientists. Because I think they have lack of understanding, and they are just trying to prove their point. Like, okay, I mean, science is not saying it. But do they know what the science related to vaccine is really saying about?
Right.
Means they claim that the scientist as a person is saying, but that scientist as a person is one responsible for developing the science. So who else will do that? So I don't understand this.
Yeah, I don't see, this is not getting at anything very interesting. Certainly scientists, they're people, they have their biases, but obviously equations don't speak. So,
Right.
If you want to tell someone, a comet is going to hit the Earth, you're talking about the equations that someone has solved. Right? The equations also don't solve themselves. Right? So it's a person or a computer that solves equations. This isn't getting at anything interesting about science. And there's no criticism of science here.
Well, I mean, he thinks he's like, he thinks that he's providing like a gotcha moment to scientists. Like,
I don't see anything interesting.
No, of course not.
So I want to ask you real quick, Cease. There's a thing here. It says the has verificationism not been overturned in philosophical circles more than half a century ago? So I'm gonna real quick say, like, seems like pretty much the consensus is that logical positivism is kind of, especially the verification principles, like self-defeating in terms of the way that logical positivists have framed that specific principle. I'm wondering, Cease, where you fall on that, if you call yourself a logical positivist, and then what you think about Quine's work. I'm more so under the assessment that the whole analytic synthetic distinction is kind of what convinced me, at least, to that it is self-refuting. But I was just curious of your position.
What I would say is that I don't think any of us are arguing, like I was saying earlier, for a kind of dogmatic verificationism. Like, I don't think any of us are saying that.
Yeah, yeah. I just wanted you to be able to clarify in case people were thinking some other,
the problem again remains: how do we talk about knowledge? How do we derive knowledge, or at least justified belief?
Mm-hmm.
I know some people define it in knowledge as justified true belief. So I don't have the expectation of any worldview to be able to justify everything about the worldview. I don't think that, other than the fact that I exist, I don't believe I can have certainty about anything. Okay, I don't think science gives us certainty about anything. I'm okay with that. The problem I find is that religion doesn't get off the ground. Religion can't even, provide any kind of credibility as to why we should trust its ideas as being anything but pure imagination. And when it tries to do that, what I find is that it ends up being nothing more than language games that have little connection to actual phenomena that we can look at and examine. And I don't think that is enough to then talk about truth and talk about knowledge and talk about the state of affairs. In that quote, I'm not going to read the rest, but he's talking about premises and the negation of premises and all of these things, but then he wants to remove the methodology that we can apply to move us beyond the imagination to something we can actually observe. And I guess the challenge that they're trying to make is that, we can't observe, that we should trust observation. I think he wants to say something like that, like that somehow empiricism is self-defeating because we can't be sure that we can trust our senses.
But isn't that just constitutive of like anything that would be required for their position as well? That seems just weird to me, but I don't know.
But also, all of this is resolved when you take a fallibilistic approach to knowledge. Like, I don't need to believe that our senses work every time to say that we are justified in trusting them most of the time, because even when we observe its failures, we're still doing that to our senses. So I don't think there's any problem there. These are just failed attempts to kind of undermine the scientific method, to somehow say, well, it's okay because, it's okay that the theist has these presuppositions because a scientist does as well. That's the kind of thing they're trying to do.
I would say that everyone at some level is a scientist and adopts the scientific method. We wouldn't be able to get through life. We wouldn't be able to get through our daily lives if we didn't do this kind of thing. And to then come back and use our modern technology to say things like, science, we can't verify anything, is just completely ignoring the procedures that you use to get around in life.
Yeah.
So it's very strange to me.
I want to show a couple comments here. First
just a heads up that, guys, I have just a few more minutes.
Sure. Yeah, we're going to read the last few questions, then we'll close up. So when he says that the apple falls because of a certain physical law, all he's saying is that the apple falls because the apple falls.
Who's saying this?
He's saying that you're saying this.
I'm not saying that at all. I tried my best to describe the origin of the falling of the apple. It's contained in.
You're not just saying it just happens. You have a mechanics as to what
it's saying that at all. It's all in the theory of mechanics. If you in your F equals ma equation, you put in Newton's force of gravity in the equation, then you solve the equation. It tells you what the acceleration is. You tell me what the state of the apple is at t equals 0. What's the velocity of the object? If it's sitting in my hand, its velocity is 0. That's the initial condition. You solve the equation, you get the speed of the object as a function of time, given that acceleration. If the initial velocity is 0, it tells you that it'll move in a certain way, at certain speeds. You can also derive its position as a function of time. I never did anything like that. It's completely contained in the physical structure there. This isn't a space of guessing. Right. Again, we're at a place where somehow you think that a physical theory is, there's some unknown, and then you just come in with a sentence and replace that. No, it's a very precise kind of statement. Where did the apple come from? All of that can be described. How did the apple get to my hand? Where will it be in the future? It's all in that space. You have to solve the equation, give the initial conditions, and the theory will tell you everything about the past and about the future trajectory of the apple. I don't know how else to say this.
Well, you'll have to excuse Mark. He just woke up from a nap. He's a little cranky. So
one other thing. Experiments just verify that our descriptions are correct, but they don't answer the question, why does this event occur?
No, they don't do that. The experiments support the theory. The theory is this explanation, and you can support the theory by looking at the experiments. What was the other part of that? Sorry.
So I think there's a point of confusion here.
It was the other part was, but they don't answer the question, why does this event occur, or any event?
But it's not I don't know what you mean by a description. It's a statement of dynamics, right? When you say F equals ma, maybe you're asking where does F equal ma come from? Right? If we're in Newtonian theory, F equals ma is the thing that tells you about why the object will move, because there's a force, and forces lead to accelerations.
I think he's asking a question that's ultimately unanswerable on any worldview, is why is it that these are the laws? Why are the laws what they are? Why isn't it something
different question? That's not what's being...
No, maybe I'm misunderstanding, but I think that's when he says, why does this event occur? I think that's what...
You need to be precise about a question. So there's a description in the theory. You can say, where does F equals ma come from? Why is that the law? You can ask that question, and the answer is, I don't know.
Right.
And I think people find some sense of purpose by asking this kind of question.
Sure.
Because I must congratulate him or her for asking such deeper question, because we are not asking such deeper questions. We are asking about how it happens, the cause and effect. We don't know why. Yes.
Oh, every philosopher has just been, no, that's the problem.
It would be great if we could derive where the physical laws come from. Right?
No, at least we are not, I told you before also, we are not arrogant enough to say that we will answer everything.
Yeah.
But it's naive.
That's epistemically humble, and so I appreciate that.
But it's naive of anybody in any worldview to think that that why question can be answered, if it's even the right kind of question to ask. Like, maybe there isn't a why, maybe it just is the case that certain things are what they are, and then we're just examining and observing the phenomenon for what it is. Like, the why assumes an intention that may not exist in the first place. So.
Well, yeah, guys, unless you want to add anything else. I know, David, you said you got to get rolling. I worked at 2 a.m. this morning myself, so I'm going to bed. To answer Mark's question, I cannot get into VC on Discord tonight. Maybe tomorrow. I'm extremely exhausted. I'm coming up on 24 hours. So I am going to go to bed. But I am so grateful for David and Chandra to come on. I hope we can make this. I know we said this at the very first episode we did with David. So I hope we make this a regular thing, and it has been the case. Hopefully we extend that to Chandra, and it's just 4 of us doing more episodes. I think that'd be great. I'm going to just give one quick little spiel. If you want to help support the show, you can support us on Patreon. You can become a patron at patreon.com/Axioms on Trial. You can also, we're working on ways to support us directly, and maybe like a Cash App or something like that if you just want to donate without fees or things. I don't know. We're looking at that. We're going to do this, like we said, regardless of any of that. So nothing is required. The only thing we ask of you is to hit the like button and subscribe because that ultimately helps us get out there to more people. So thank you for that. I will get off of all those announcements and cease, and I'll let you kind of close it out with them, and we'll get out of here.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah. Thanks again for coming on. It's a pleasure every time. So hopefully we have you guys back on soon.
Thank you. Interesting as usual.
I always like having conversations with you.
Agreed.
So with that said, hopefully we can provide more regular content soon. I have some ideas going, about potential introductions to different philosophical perspectives that are maybe coming out with a series. Oh, thank you so much, Zachariah. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We appreciate that. Yeah, thank you to everyone that's donated, super chats, all those types of things. That was the thing I was missing to say. Appreciate all that. We appreciate everybody watching. You guys are awesome. To David and Chandra, there's going to be it says countdown live ending. You can just click out whenever you want, so don't worry about that. Peace out. Much love. Love you guys.
Thanks again.
Okay, thanks. Bye.